Sargon of Akkad, the first prophet and the first leader of an empire, was an Akkadian ruler active in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, during the 24th to the 23rd centuries BC. He was the founder of the Sargonic or Old Akkadian dynasty, which ruled for about a century after his death, until the Gotherian conquest of the territories of Mesopotamia. I mentioned Sargon as a prophet, and even as the first prophet, because in many ways he was. I will now tell you the story of how he began as a prophet of the gods. I will now tell you the story of how he was left on a river, similar to how Moses was left on a river. She set me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river, which rose over me. The river bore me up and carried me to Akki, the drawer of water. Akki, the drawer of water, took me as his son and reared me. Akki, the drawer of water, appointed me as his gardener. While I was a gardener, Ishtar granted me her love, and for 4 and the inscription ends, years I exercised kingship. This tale might have even inspired the tale about Moses, or there existed an even older thematic view about this that inspired both tales. But in any way, from other inscriptions and tales, we know that after Sargon had received the divine message from Ishtar, a Sumerian and Akkadian goddess, he managed to get close to a king in the city where he lived, of Akkad. And he managed to poison the king and take over the throne, by the help of the gods according to Akkadian legend. Through claims of reciting the will of the gods and being their messenger, and probably through a lot of other skillful political work, which we don't have much information about, Sargon of Akkad managed to bring people to support him, and he managed to build an empire. The first great empire of the world, arguably, by conquering the various Sumerian and Akkadian city-states that existed in Mesopotamia. And even if it isn't the first great empire of the world, it is the first great empire of the Middle East. Empire as in a state that composed more than one culture, as this empire of Akkad composed both the Akkadians, which were a Semitic people that had wandered into the area a couple of 100 years before, and the Sumerians, a people having a language that is unrelated to any known living language today. They had lived in the area as the area's first original inhabitants, but both were now under Sargon. And the first time that the city-states of Mesopotamia would be unified under one power and under common law or religion, as Sargon, in his legacy, left a legal code or law or religion, a dino, given by the goddess Ishtar. The term dino can be translated into many things, but see it as a kind of social contract, almost, that guarantees justice, enforces charity and so on. A kind of social contract based upon religion, and would be the first example of what could be called the typical Middle Eastern Semitic theonomocracy, ruled by divine law. And the example of Sargon is an early example of this, where you have a divine law or religion, and men of religion as judges and local rulers that are there to implement the religion and the law. A system of great decentralization, with rather weak central rulership, but the law coming from the divine, the order coming from the divine, has great legitimacy, and thus will be implemented despite this. Among a surprisingly rather flat hierarchy among the priests rulers that existed back in those times in Mesopotamia. You have to remember that many of these rulers used to be rulers of independent city-states, as Mesopotamia, before Sargon of Akkad conquered them, used to be a bunch of city-states after all. And great independence to these priest rulers below Sargon had to be maintained. Yet there needed to exist some sort of law in the empire that could be considered legitimate by people, outside of just through mortal brute force, which there did not exist the structures to impose constantly across the entire empire. And thus, the creation of a divine law given from Ishtar was needed in order to create this unity. Through the legitimacy of religion, this was a law to be implemented by other rulers beneath Sargon and after Sargon of Akkad. Implement is also the key word here, not make law, as the law was directly given by the divine and ought to be considered, after all, above the law of man, if we consider the divine to stand above man. Though the legacy of Sargon as the first empire builder might not have survived to this day as a living tradition, it is maybe not so much his own legacy that he left that is interesting, but maybe he being the first example of a pattern, or maybe the first recorded example of a pattern, with prophets that would claim revelation from either gods or a god, or the one god in the later Abrahamic religions, bringing with them a law, an order based upon the divine that organizes society. You can see this in the later law of Hammurabi, the halacha of the Jews based upon the Jewish prophets, the Feta laws in Ethiopia and with their type of Christianity, and the Sharia in Islam based upon the Quran and the example of Muhammad, all made in a similar way and made to bring order to a society that otherwise would be constantly warring clans and tribes, without the legitimacy of the idea about the divine giving orders and ordering society and how it should be, standing above mortal affairs and ordering justice by being the ultimate authority over humanity. Though there is a problem, as not much is known about Sargon's directly divine law, though, so this is an issue. We only have references to it, and some very scant remnants of it. Though we do know that the example or traditions of Sargon were followed after him, as Sargon appears as this legendary prophet figure in the Neo-Assyrian literature of the 8th to the 7th centuries BC, which is more than 14 centuries, which would make actually the legacy of Sargon longer than the legacy left by Muhammad and his message. Tablets with fragments of the Sargon birth legend and the rest of the 4 Sargon epos which are associated with Sargon were found in the library of Ashurbanipal, alongside the law of Hammurabi, another famous figure in Mesopotamian history that later would claim to have received a law from the divine. Other tablets and remnants about Sargon's life have been found elsewhere as well, from far earlier times. Between these Assyrian tablets of the library of Ashurbanipal and the time of Sargon of Akkad. And though we have very little about his law, we do know that a lot of this literature that existed about Sargon talk about following the example of Sargon, his riddu, something to repeat or emulate, his tradition to follow, as he was considered the perfect ruler to emulate. And these were also together with the direct revelations from Ishtar and the other gods, a part of the Dino, the religious order to follow. However, the fragmentary remains of any direct revelation in comparison to the actually rather substantial amount of text relating to the life of Sargon of Akkad makes it so that we that live in the modern times are in this kind of strange situation where it would be kind of like if we did not have the Tanakh but we had the oral Talmud in small parts, or we did not have the Quran but we had some of the Hadith stories about Muhammad and parts of the biography of Muhammad, his Sirah. If we only had these sources and all believers in Islam and Judaism were gone, we would have had a very different view of Islam and Judaism. And this is a thought about what can happen in several thousands of years in the future to civilizations and their religions. And the legacy of Sargon is very well preserved. Most things do not last as long, over 1,000 years, such as in the case of Sargon, and him being seen as an example to emulate by the new Assyrians as a living tradition. Nor do they survive for several thousands of years as remnants to be discovered by us later in modern times. It is almost like by divine will that the legacy of Sargon reached us. The great legacy of the world's first recorded empire builder, or the first recorded prophet that brought law to the land and gave it legitimacy through the gods. A first recorded example of what would become a repeating pattern in the history of the Middle East. Hopefully you found this interesting, my viewers. Again, if you have any questions or opinions about this, please post them in the comment section and I will try to answer.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.